Hey guys, here is the final part of this tutorial. So here I'm going to start out by tracing my two-piece collar pattern. If you want to watch the tutorial on how I made this pattern, I'm going to put a link in the description and you can check it out. Now after tracing, I'm going to go ahead and separate the pattern pieces. So I have a top collar and then the stand collar. Now once my pieces are cut, I'm first going to cut out the interfacing for the collar. Also note the center back is going to be cut and fold. The interfacing I'm using here is called shape flex. So if you like your collar to be a little stiff or sturdy, you can go ahead and use more than one layer. But in this case, I'll just be using one layer. Next, I'm going to just cut these pieces out without seam allowance. Next, I'm going to make notches on the top part of the collar just to note that point. So here I'm pinning in place the pattern pieces on the fabric. Now this time around, I'm going to make sure to cut 2 pieces each and also leave 1/2 inch seam allowance on all sides except the center back, which is already cut and fold. Now after cutting, I'm going to lay the interfacing in the middle of the fabric like so and then just give it a good press. So here I've gone ahead to iron on my interfacing. Now at this point at the bottom, you can decide to iron that on or you can decide to do a top stitch, whichever way you prefer, but I like to do a top stitch over it instead of ironing it down. To join the collars, I will be sewing 1/2 inch all around except the bottom part. Now here I'm going to cut out 2 strings that I'm going to later use to turn the sharp corners on my collar. So starting with, I'm going to sew the stand part of the collar. Like I said, I like to top stitch this area, but if you like, you can iron that instead of top stitching. Next, I'm going to go ahead and make a notch around the center of the stand collar. Now to sew the top collar, I'm going to start by sewing all sides, like I said, except the bottom. Now make sure you're sewing just beside the interfacing and not over it. Now once I get to the sharp corner point, I'm going to place the middle of my string right at the tip of the corner. Now holding on to the other side of the string, which is right at the tip of my corner, I'm going to run a stitch over it. Next, I'm going to turn the collar like so and then slide the other half right inside the fabric and then just finish up my seam and basically repeat the same to the other side of the corner of the collar. Now once that is done, I'm just going to trim off the corners like so and trim off some of the seam allowance, just leaving about 1/4 inch. To turn the collar inside out, I'm going to hold both ends of the strings and then just pull till my corners are pointy enough. And I'll just repeat the same to the other side of the corner. Now once the corners are fully turned, I'm just going to pull out the strings like so and give it a good press. Now to attach the top collar to the stand part of the collar, I'm going to lay the non-interface part of the top collar onto the side of the interfaced stand collar. After pinning in place, I'm going to grab the other side of the stand collar, which was not interfaced, lay it over it like so and pin in place. And then I'm just going to sew around with 1/2 inch. Now sew beside the interfacing and not over it. Doing it this way lets the fold around the stand lay much better. Next, I'm going to trim off some of the seam allowance and just leave it at about 1/4 inch or slightly less. Now after trimming, I'm going to turn my collar inside out and also give that a good press. Now here's what it looks like all pressed. The next thing to do is to attach it to the neckline of the romper. Here's one more look on how it looks on the dress form. So at this point, I've notched the center of the stand part of the collar. Now I'm just going to make sure to align it to the center back of the romper. Now I'm going to pin from inside of the romper going out. So here I'm just going to pin towards the CF, pin the center, and then pin on the other side of the CF. Now the CF in this case is the button wrap. Now after pinning, I'm going to sew around the neckline with 1/2 inch. Now when you're sewing this part, make sure to lift up the stand part of the collar so you do not run a stitch over it. So here's what it looks like after running the stitch. Next, I'm just going to notch around, not too close to the seam but just slightly above. And before I close up the collar finally, I'm just going to double check the length to see that it aligns around the button wrap so that one side is not longer than the other. Now you want to make sure they align right at the top of the center front. Now to close it up, I'm just going to tuck my seam in like so and basically just run a top stitch all around. So here I continue the top stitch around the center front of the stand collar, aka the curved side, and basically just did that all around. Now here's what it looks like all done. You can also do a top stitch around the top collar, but in this case I didn't want to, so I just left it that way. So here's a final look of the collar already attached to the romper. The next thing to do is to draft the drop sleeve. To draft the sleeve, I'm first going to measure around the armhole. Now after measuring around the armhole, I had 16.5 inches. So here are the following measurements that I'm going to need to draft this drop sleeve. The armhole, which was 16.5 inch, the sleeve length 22 inches, the wrist width 9 inches, and the cuff length 1.5 inch. Now this is per preference. If you want your cuff length to be longer, you can use from 2.5 to about 3 inches for the length of the cuff. So on my pattern paper, I'm going to first start by ruling a margin. Now this is going to be the center of my sleeve, meaning I'm drafting only half side of the sleeve, which I'll later place on fold to cut a full sleeve. Please take note, this is not going to be a standard sleeve block. Now measuring from the top edge of the paper, I'm going to mark 2 inches down from that point. The 2 inches in this case was the measurement I used to drop the shoulder when I was making the romper pattern. So the crown of the sleeve is going to be slanted as opposed to the actual curve around a standard sleeve block. Now before I mark the slant, I'm first going to mark the width of the sleeve. Now to get the width of the sleeve, I'm going to divide the armhole measurement by 2, which is 16.5 inches divided by 2. In this case, it's 8.25 inch. Now to properly mark this, you're going to place your tape at the edge of the center line and measure in a slanted form. I'll mark that point, and then from there I'm going to mark 2 inches for the slant of the sleeve. Next, I'm going to connect from this point to the tip of the center line. Next, I'm going to mark the length of the sleeve. Now in this case, the length of the sleeve was 22 inches. Now because we're having a cuff and because we slanted the shoulder, we're going to minus the cuff length and the slant of the shoulder. Because mind you, the length of the sleeve did not start from our actual shoulder point. It started 2 inches below the shoulder point. So a quick recap will be length of sleeve minus 2 inches, which was for the drop shoulder, and then minus 1.5 inch for the cuff length, which means we're deducting 3.5 inches from the length of the sleeve, which is 22 inches, giving us 18.5 inch as the final length of our sleeve. Now another way to measure this is basically just marking the 3.5 inch instead of starting at 1 inch. So here you'd see this 3.5 inch up top, and then I can just mark 22. That's another way of doing it. So once I've marked the length, I'm just going to connect like so, and then from this point I'm going to mark the cuff width, which is the same as the wrist width. So side note, when you're measuring the wrist for a cuff sleeve, you're going to make sure to add an extra 1 inch or 1.5 inch. Now that extra is basically the wrap for the button on the cuff. So in this case, my wrist was 9 inches and half of 9 inches is 4.5 inch. So here as the final width of the sleeve, I measured 5.5 inch, which was with the extra 1 inch for the wrap. Next, I'm just going to connect from this point up onto the top like so. So here the sleeve is done. I've drafted without any seam allowance. So when I'm cutting, I'm just going to add 1/2 inch seam allowance all around, except the center line, which is going to be cut and fold. Next, I'm just going to cut out my sleeve pattern and also mark the points where I'll be adding my seam allowance. Next, I'm going to just place my pattern on the fabric and cut out 2 pieces with my center line unfold. So next, I'm going to mark the opening for the cuffs. Now to do this, I'm going to take 1/2 of the sleeves and then fold it towards the center line while making sure my 1/2 inch seam allowance is excluded. Now on the folded line, I'm going to go ahead and mark 3 inches, which I'll be using as the length of the opening. Once that is done, I'm going to cut on the folded line. So side note, I cut through both layers of the sleeve. So basically, these were 2 of my sleeves laid on top each other. So here I've gone ahead to overlock all sides of the sleeves except the bottom part. Next, I'm going to face the opening which we cut. For the length of the facing, you can make it about 2 inches or 1.5 inches longer than the opening. And then for the width, I used 1.5 inch. The taping on the opening is going to be finished on the right side of the fabric. So I'm sewing from the wrong side, turning it to the right side. Before getting to the sharp corner, I'm going to make 2 notches right at the tip of those corners. It just makes it a little easier to maneuver this sharp corner. Next, I'm going to just fold the taping over the right side of the fabric like so and just finish that seam. We're going to finish the taping in such a way that one side is going to overlap on the other side of the taping. Next, I'm going to run a triangular stitch right at the center of the taping. Now that stitch just allows it to overlap. For design preference, I'll be adding a pleat, which is slightly less than 1 inch. Now the pleat is going to face towards the opening. Now once pinned in place, I'm just going to go ahead and finish off the side seam of the sleeve. And here I'm just sewing out 1/2 inch as the seam allowance. Now once that is done, just going to open out the seams flat and give that a good press. Here I turn my sleeves inside out, and next I'm just going to measure around the cuff to see the final width. For the final width of the cuffs, I had 9.5 inches. To prepare the cuffs, I'm going to start with my interfacing, and this is the same interfacing I used for the collar. To cut the interfacing for the cuffs, I'm going to use the length of the cuff, which was 1.5 inch. But for preference, I like to make it a little bit more, just so that it rolls over on the fabric when I place it. You'll see that later in the video. So here I ended up using 1 3/4 inch instead of 1.5. Either way works just fine. Next, I'm going to mark the exact width of the cuffs, which was 9.5 inch in this case. And I'm just going to cut that out. To cut the fabric for the cuffs, I'm going to use 4 inches as the length, because the length of the cuffs on fold is 3 inches. Now 1 inch will be added to that, which would be the seam allowance. For the width of the cuffs, I'm going to use 10.5 inches, which was 9.5 inch as the original width, plus 1 inch for the seam allowance. And next, I'm just going to cut that out. I'm going to cut 2 pieces. Next, I'm just going to lay the interfacing over the fabric, leaving 1/2 inch on top for the seam allowance, and just give it a good press. So at this point, my interfacing has been ironed on. Next, I'm going to just sew this part down with 1/2 inch. Next, I'm going to fold it into 2 like this, leaving 1/2 inch up top for the seam allowance. Also making sure that the finished fold is 1.5 inch, which was the length of the cuff. Next, I'm going to sew both sides of the cuff with 1/2 inch. If you've made it far to this point of the video, thank you for staying, and please give this video a like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll be happy to respond. Next, I'm going to trim off the seam allowance on the corner and turn it inside out. Now once turned out, I will just go ahead and give it a good press. So here's what it looks like all finished, and this was what I meant by allowing my interfacing to roll over to the other side of the fabric. To attach it to the sleeve, I'm going to be starting from the inside facing out. So I'm going to open up my seam allowance at the side, place it at one side of the opening, pin in place, and basically just run a stitch around using 1/2 inch. And here just checking to make sure it aligns so that one side is not longer than the other. Next, I'm going to unpin and then tuck the seam allowance in and finish up with a top stitch. So here's what it looks like all done. And here I'm just checking to see how tightly the wrap is going to fit around my hands. Now you can adjust accordingly. If you want a more tighter fit, then you can overlap more. But if you want a loose fit, then reduce the overlapping. Next, it's time to attach the sleeves to the romper. Now to properly insert the sleeve, I'm going to make an extra opening. Now please note, this opening does not mean I'm increasing the armhole width. It just means that I need more room to finish up the armhole properly. My finished armhole is still going to be 16.5 inches. Alright, so next I'm just going to fold my shoulder like so to get the center. Just going to lay the sleeves side by side based on how I'm going to attach it. Now note, you want to make the opening of the cuffs face the back. Next, I'm going to pin the center of the sleeve to the center of the shoulder. And I'm going to repeat the same to the other side of the romper. Once pinned in place, I'm going to turn my fabric inside out, so it's easy for me to finish up the sleeves. So I'm going to start from the center point, sew up all the way to the underarm point. So I'm ending at the underarm point and I'm going to pin out the other side. Now because this sleeve is going to be more like an inset sleeve, I won't be sewing over the underarm point. I'm basically going to flip the seam and then start from the other side and finish. Next, I'm just going to close up the remainder of the side seam. Now, this was what I meant by an inset sleeve. And here is the finished look. The other part of the sleeve was sewn off camera. Now, at this point, the romper is about 90% done. The only thing left to do is to mark my buttonholes. So here I'm marking out the spacing for the buttons. Now for the first button from the top of the collar, I like to start with 2.5 or 3 inches, and then the ones in the middle I use about 3.5 to 4 inches as the spacing. Now if you want to see a video of me sewing on the buttonholes, do let me know in the comments. For the buttonholes on the wrap, I like to mark that vertical, and then the buttonhole up top of the collar, I mark that horizontally, same way as the cuff. So here is the final look again. So this is what it looks like. Sure did love this fit. I got so much compliments when I wore it this past summer. Let me know what you guys think in the comment, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I will see you in my next.